entertainment, current events, and Hollywood. Don't miss Creator to Creators, hosted by the filmmaker Meosha Bean, known for the Shudder hit documentary Horror Noir and the acclaimed film Anatomy of an Anti-Hero, Redemption. This show features interviews with filmmakers and creatives from around the globe. Join the fun with guest celebrities and gain valuable insights. Subscribe now and follow Creator to Creators.
Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Creators to Creators today. Today we have a special guest.
N.LHolmes here.
Welcome. So I really love going back to the beginning. I always say the beginning kind of, charts our trajectory in life, our little habits that we pick up along the way, follow us into our adulthood. Tell me a little bit about your childhood. What was that like? And I'm just very curious about your childhood.
Well, I grew up in Texas, in Fort Worth, and I come from a family that loved books. The house was always full of them. I had an aunt who was the book editor of the local paper, and my father wrote short stories for Boy's Life and things of that sort. Later, he went into advertising. My mother read to me all the time, and my cousin and I used to sit around on rainy days and write novels when we were little. And sometimes I even finished one. So it was filled with books and art. My mother and aunt were artists, and they were also, along with my grandmother, dancers, professional dancers. So it was quite a creative family.
Nice. That's really cool. I love that you grew up around that. Um, it's interesting because I read, your bio is so interesting. You were a nun at some point.
Right.
It's very interesting. And so how did that happen? And how did you find yourself in that situation?
Well, perhaps the context will explain it. This was in the 60s, and we
Mm,
were all seeking meaning and something to give our lives to at that period. I had friends who entered ashrams here and there, but for
mm.
me, it was the Discalced Carmelite nuns, which was a cloistered order. And I I went in and stayed for nearly 20 years
Wow.
um, before I began to feel that I had probably served my time there, and it had served its purpose in my life. So it was time to do something else.
Mm. And I'm just so curious of that like 20 years. You know, did you enjoy it? I guess so,
I
right?
don't know that enjoyment is the word. It was in some ways it was a beautiful life. There was the rhythm of the year, the liturgical year, with Christmas would come and Lent and Easter and all of this, and it was very very predictable, but it became a wonderful ritual that you look forward to, and every day had its structure around silence and prayer and manual labor.
Mm,
We rarely spoke to one another. We did have a period of recreation every day,
mm.
but otherwise it was quiet.
So,
And yeah, that I think that was in a way was a preparation for the writer's life, which is very solitary and sort of
mm,
interior.
very interesting. Were you doing that in when you would were you interested in while you were a nun, like writing and doing that? Did that love did you were you writing while you were doing it inside?
No, not really. It was the order was more dedicated to manual work than
Mm,
intellectual work.
gotcha.
I did some writing, things like little devotional booklets and stuff, but mostly I did artwork, other than just the manual kind of labor we all did.
Wow.
So I designed the stained glass windows when we built a new monastery, and did holy cards and booklets and things. I designed vestments, liturgical vestments.
That's amazing. So when did it so you get 20 years go by, nearly 20 years, right? And then
Mhm.
you have this, like, what it served its purpose. And the next thing, it was archaeologist. Is that what it was?
Well, yeah, that was sort of a return to the original trajectory. I had wanted to be an archaeologist since a very small child. I'm not, I think it was watching movies, these sword and sandal epics like The Egyptian and Land of the
Mm,
Pharaohs and stuff. And that had always attracted me. I used to make paper dolls of Egyptians and things of that sort.
wow.
So the first time I found myself back in college, I signed up for classical studies and started moving in the direction of archaeology.
Mm. Wow, that's incredible. That's incredible.
It was
It's really interesting. A very colorful career, I must say. Must colorful life, honestly. It's very
not
interesting.
much dialogue, at least for those few years.
That's amazing. I and I'm just curious. You get into that world, and so I'm curious of the of just that archaeology. You're archaeologist, and did you, like, what was that life like compared to being a nun for 20 years? Did you feel like you were, like, kind of out of the loop and, like, just getting back into the world because you were kind of closed off from it, sort of?
Well, in fact, I was, but I never felt that as a negative. It's not as
Okay.
if I had been born in the convent. I mean, I had some awareness of the world. So
Right.
things had changed. Credit cards were in, and
Right.
the clothing was different and everything. But computers had just come in too.
Mm,
But I did not feel particularly estranged from secular society, really. I found the reintegration very easy. And maybe that's the sort of the anthropologist in me. It's just becoming one with a strange culture wasn't that hard.
yeah.
Uh, and sort of, once I was integrated into the academic community, it was very congenial. And I met a lot of people I liked and made friends. So it was, and though it's true that I was a lot older than most of the undergraduate students. As you can
Mm,
imagine, I was 40 when I came out.
wow. Okay. Okay.
But I don't know. I'd sort of been on ice and had a fresh young take on things, so I didn't feel dated or separated from the others.
That's awesome. Your books often draws connection between ancient Egypt and modern society. What lessons from that era do you think are, most relevant today?
Well, I have to say that the Lord Hani Mysteries, which was a series of 6 books that takes place between the coming to the throne of Akhenaten, the so-called heretic pharaoh, and his death and immediate successors, and then the coming of Tutankhamun, his son, to the throne, was a period that paralleled with incredible accuracy what our world was going through as I was writing these things in the in my late teens and early 20s. For one thing, there was a plague going on.
Mm,
And then you had an enormous social upheaval with all the old values sort of overturned in a minute and people feeling very displaced and
mhm.
angry and rebellious. And it was, I felt like we could learn a lot about our present dilemma by looking at at least this particular moment in the past.
Sure.
It's not that things ever repeat themselves exactly, but they kind of spiral around to the same general place over and over. And I think we're less prejudiced in looking at someone else's problems than our
Hmm.
own.
Hmm.
So I couldn't help have it reinforce what I'd always thought, I suppose, that the study of history really has a lot that we forget at our own peril.
Mm, that's very true. Very true. Can you share uh an archaeologist's discovery, right, that
Mhm.
directly influenced a scene or a character in your novel?
I'm not sure that there's any object that I found that shows up in the novels.
Ah,
But
interesting.
there are documents, ancient documents for sure,
Okay, interesting.
things that I encountered in my studies or in preparation for classes, for example.
Okay.
I taught a class on ancient Near Eastern empires, right? And among the documents that we looked at was a small collection, 4 or 5 brief mentions of a certain royal divorce in the Syrian city-state of Ugarit.
Hmm.
And they were just little hints. One would be from the king who divorced his wife, and one would be from her brother, and one would be from their overlord, and you just got snippets like you were traveling past the event on a train and just saw things whiz past the window. And so I gave my students what we knew, those few documents, and said, try to reconstruct what happened.
Hmm.
And some of the reconstructions were pretty fanciful, but then what else could they be?
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
didn't know enough. So I thought to myself at this point, when I retire, I'm going to turn this into a novel. It's just, it's too tempting to fill in the gaps of our
Yeah.
knowledge with the imagination. So that's essentially what I did. That turned into my first book.
And how was that? That making that and the process?
Well, it was interesting. I found it very congenial. I mean, when you're writing historiography, you have to restrain yourself and not use your imagination to
Sure.
not connect the dots. But in writing a novel, that's what you're there to do. So
Mhm.
the history gives you a few pegs to hang your plot on, and then you develop the historical characters into somebody who would behave in a certain way. And, it was an eye-opening process, and I found I really loved it. And the rest, as they say, is history, at least modern history.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's amazing. I mean, and yeah. I mean, you've written so many amazing books. Are there any books that you've written that were kind of hard to write or
Yes, yes. The second book that I wrote, actually, which was also partly spurred by contemporary events and partly by some, events in the past,
Mhm.
was The Singer and Her Song that talked about some Syrian refugees. They keep seeming to happen
Mhm.
in the 13th century BC, and it was very, very painful to write, partly because of the situation, which was horrendous, in
Yeah.
which these people, they were musicians, a family of musicians, found themselves, and expelled from their city by its conquest by the Assyrians, and also because the protagonist was a very damaged person, and then
Mm.
on top of that, PTSD. So
Mm.
being in her head for months while I wrote this was just agony. I so wanted to finish this book.
Yeah.
I think she has a redeeming moment at the end, but it was hard.
Yeah. That's amazing. Do you feel the pressure? Like, I mean, I don't know, like as a filmmaker, I do, when you're working with different companies or distribution, you have to have the certain things done at a certain time. Do you feel pressure to get something like to have like to meet deadlines and how do you deal with that?
Well, and for the most part, I have published my books independently, which means I'm
Nice.
the I'm the boss. I
I
don't have
love
to meet
that.
anyone's deadline. I, and I've also published some through a publishing house, and there I did feel a deadline,
Yeah.
in part because both of those books were promised to them as a serial to be published serially through an experimental format that Amazon had called Vela.
Hmm.
And that meant you had to turn out 1,500 words or something every week. And
Wow.
it was grueling. For one thing, you lose track of your plot. I
Right.
found it very hard. But for the most part, I do write unusually fast, perhaps, and it's partly because I don't know. I guess now I have my characters and my settings all established, and I don't have to do a lot of research between books.
That's
So
good.
I can produce two of these sort of lightweight, um, cozy mysteries a year
That's
easily.
that's
I don't,
amazing.
yeah, I don't have to, rush or feel any pressure.
Wow, that's awesome. How did you approach expanding your original ideas into like three interconnected series, right? Like, did any surprise themes or characters emerge during that process?
Yes, actually, it's surprising. I don't think people really set out to embed themes. You're
Sure,
thinking about plots and characterizations and things like that.
sure.
But in writing the Lord Hani mysteries, the first of the series that I set in Egypt, I was basing this on real characters and everything.
Hmm.
And one of the very few things we knew about Lord Hani, who was a diplomat, was the name of his father, because that's the way they identified themselves, like a surname.
Hmm.
So his father became a character in the book, and uh, therefore their relationship became a kind of a major thing. And then Hani's children play a big role. His In the first book, his son goes over to the dark side with the so-called reforms of Akhenaten, and there
Hmm.
were a lot of issues throughout the books that dealt with children and their parents, and kind of how you carry the burden of your forebears
Hmm.
without even knowing it. And so that became a kind of theme. And then the second series that was spun off of that is further adventures of Hani's family in the person of his daughter, Nefret, his youngest daughter,
Hmm.
whom we have already met as a physician. And she and her partners set out to solve murders, much as her father did. And there's still that interplay between her and her parents, and her and her brothers and sisters, and the grandparents and everything. So
Yeah,
it's a continuing thing.
that's awesome. I love that. It's so I mean, not everybody, not many people can do that, and you do it so effortlessly. Um,
I don't know. I'm what they call a pantser. Some people plot in advance, what we call the plotters,
hmm.
lay everything out, outline it and everything. I'm not that kind of writer. I have to. I tried that on the first book, and I
Hmm.
thought I would die. I would sit there with a blank piece of paper trying to put my plot down in basic steps, and I couldn't come up with anything. I just thought, well, I have no imagination. I just can't write. But
It,
when I
it,
started the other method, which is
uh,
simply to start writing and let the plot spin itself out, then I found that very congenial.
I love that. So is that a thing? Because I've talked to a few authors in my time on the show, and I always say, people say, oh, writer's block. So some people say it doesn't exist, some people say it does. So is there such thing as writer's block?
You know what I think it is trying to write in the way that is not congenial for you. I
Mm,
think that had I persisted in trying to plot before I wrote,
sure.
I would have been in a state of permanent writer's block.
Mm.
So, that's my little piece of advice to writers. Just don't be too sure that's the way you have to do it, even though that's what books may tell you.
Sure. Absolutely. Um, nowadays, with all everything's happening politically, just how the world is now, completely it just feels like there's so many things happening around the world. And it feels like it's so heavy,
Yeah.
with all the issues that are happening in the world. But I'm just curious with the parallel today, how did this political and cultural shift in ancient Egypt reflect modern day issues? And were there any parallels that surprised you during your research?
Yes. And I think what we were going through in, say, the late teens and early 20s, when I was writing that series, more political series,
Hmm.
um, it helped me to write about the ancient situation, because in a way we were experiencing that too. And I could see all around me how dislocating it was for people. For
Yeah,
one thing, we had the COVID epidemic going on,
yeah.
and they too had a plague. We had kind of a cultural dislocation. with wokeism and those who were rebelling against it. And it was, people were mad. I mean, really mad. And you had parties rising up that wanted to tear everything back down. And it was very much like what was happening then. Akhenaten was, of course, an absolute ruler. When he
Hmm.
came to the throne, he could decree any changes he wanted. And so he decided to overturn the whole religious schema of Egypt, which was millennia old and
Mm,
embedded in every aspect of their culture. So he threw out gradually the worship of virtually all the gods, but predominantly Amun Ra, the main sun god,
mm,
and replaced it with the worship of the Aten, who was already known. I mean, he was like the visible face of the sun, but not a major object of cult. So
hmm.
that was the first jolt, and then he started suppressing the cult of Ra and the other gods. And they were not only a religious establishment, but an
Mm.
enormous economic engine. They owned, vast, like a quarter of the land in the country, and
Wow.
employed tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. So you can imagine what happened. The whole economy just fell apart, and it was people were out of work. It
Mm,
must have been unbelievably disturbing to those. And so, in order to express this in a more personal way, I had my main character, Hani, be married into a family of priests of Amun Ra who were resistors. And he and his fellow diplomats, who were employees of this government
mm,
that was doing all of these things, it was totally contrary to their conscience. And
sure.
what do you do then? Do you follow your loyalty oath to the king,
Mm,
or do you follow your religious conscience and refuse to carry these things out? These were choices that I saw people having to make on the
yeah.
news, and
Yeah.
it really brought it home to me how much suffering there must have been.
Hmm. Yeah.
I think that is kind of dramatized by the fact that almost as soon as Akhenaten died, his whole brave new world was overthrown. The capital he built was torn down to the ground.
Wow.
He was cut out of the histories as if he had never existed. And it was
Mm,
action and reaction. It was
mm.
very, very, very strong. And I think something similar, perhaps not quite so violent, was happening here at the time. Maybe it's still happening.
I think so, I do think so. I think, like you said, that, history maybe not repeat itself, but there are parallels. There are very much things that are similar to the past to what's happening right now in the present. Like,
Yeah,
with just our government and just, wars and just the power dynamics. I feel like it seems like that is the through line to a lot of the problems. It's just power and control,
power.
you know.
And of course, the king of Egypt had no constraints on his power. He was an absolute ruler in every sense. I mean, he was the chief judge. He was the administrator. He was the priest. There was no separation of powers, no checks on him, and that can't end well.
Exactly. It can't. Which brings me to my question that I love asking every guest this question, and there's no wrong answer. Um, the three levels of influence: money, power, and respect.
Oof.
And if you could choose only one of those things, which one would you choose and why?
I guess respect, because it usually has some basis in desserts. I mean, one isn't usually respected unless one shows wisdom or goodness or something. And I think I'd rather go that route than just being rich and powerful, which can be deserved in no way.
Sure. Yeah, that's so true. Very great answer. I love that.
What else would a nun say?
You're like money. Just kidding.
Yeah.
Um, you mentioned Hana is a unique character. What inspired his creation, and what do you hope readers take away from his story?
Well, I think Hani is a good man, a man
Mhm.
of a conscience, upright and compassionate. who may even be willing to bend the law a little,
Hmm.
when humanity is at stake. A man who takes very seriously both his loyalties to his leader, his ruler, and his loyalties to his moral compass, which is not necessarily an easy fence to walk. I He's sort of the father that we all wish we had too. I mean, he was compassionate with his children. He had standards for them, and yet was extremely understanding of their foibles and their divergencies. Let's say.
Hmm.
I think anybody could learn from him since he's sort of a composite of all the things I think are wonderful. But rulers, people who carry responsibilities, I think they should emulate his sensitivity to his conscience, and his compassion
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
his flexibility.
Mm, yeah. Do you feel like, you said that uh, were independently uh put these books out, which you are your own boss, and I actually love that. I'm such an advocate for, I feel like we live in a time where freedom of speech is so crucial, and I feel like when you do stuff the mainstream, not all the time, but I do see that happens from time to time that, there's very much a lot of censorship. People like to censor people, and people
Yeah,
can't really express themselves fully, or to the detriment of their career, possibly if they say something that is too left or too far right. Just kind of have that sweet spot. um,
yeah,
um, what advice would you give independent authors? Like, because it is there's some people that want to be that, to go mainstream, but also maintain that their voice.
yeah. And I have to preface this by saying it was exactly that I had an agent in the
Mhm.
beginning, and we just didn't see eye to eye about certain things that
Mhm.
I felt were part of the integrity of my portrayal of the past.
Sure.
So I didn't feel like I could, take her advice in some places. And so I thought it was better if we part company. So that's how I started off independently.
Was that
But
hard?
it was in a sense, but I can see in retrospect and saw pretty quickly that given my age, since I was retired when I began this career, to go the traditional way through an agent and
Hmm.
wait till she shopped each book separately to a publisher.
Hmm.
And then the publisher, even if he took them all at once, would put out maybe one a year. This was going to take a while.
Hmm.
And that didn't fit my urgent time schedule. So that was another reason that it seemed better for me to go independent. So I would say to those who are considering whether it fits their agenda better to publish traditionally or independently, um, consider independent publishing. I don't think there's a stigma attached to it as much as there used to be. And
Okay.
maybe not at all, in fact, because there have been some really good books put out independently. But I would say this, don't neglect to go through professional editors. You
Mm,
don't want to put something that's amateurish out there, and have a
right.
cover that is professionally designed.
Right.
You
Absolutely.
don't want to put all that work into things and then not have it look, professional. And then be prepared to work because you're going to have to do all the publicity and all everything that ordinarily a publishing house would do.
Yeah.
Not, I think that publishing houses do all of that anymore. I mean, there's a great deal more self pushing that has to be done.
Yeah. That's great advice. No, thank you so much for that. Um, are there aspects of ancient history you haven't explored yet that you'd like to tackle in the future?
Oh, certainly. I mean, there are cultures and there are moments and history that are very intriguing that I haven't gotten involved in, at least as a writer. Um, for one thing, my own training is more in Greece and the Near East rather than Egypt. I'm not
Mm.
actually an Egyptologist. So,
Okay.
there's all of that world and the Greco-Roman world and things. Occasionally I pull in a Minoan or something into one of the Egyptian novels, but haven't really zeroed in on them yet.
Oh, that's
So
interesting.
yes, there's a great big world and a lot of time out there.
I love that. Well, that's exciting.
Yeah,
Definitely
I
looking
just
forward to
me too.
seeing that. Definitely. What has been the most rewarding feedback you've received from readers, and how do you how do they connect with the modern themes in your books?
Uh, they seem to react well. I mean, the people who bother to write you are obviously ones who have connected with it in some way.
Mhm.
Uh, One person, to my relief and gratitude, was particularly moved by that book I mentioned to you that was so difficult to write, the one about the Syrian refugees. It was
Yeah.
I mean, it was a very bleak book, and she seemed to find that really spoke to her, and I'm so glad about that. It sort of makes my own agonies worthwhile to think that it touched someone in a positive way.
That's so cool. Isn't that awesome? Isn't that what it's about, right? What we get to do
Yeah,
creatively and to connect with people and somehow provoke, I don't know, some type of thought or even change. It's so cool how what we do kind of connect.
that's true. And when I think about how the books I have read, particularly
Yeah.
when I was young,
Yeah.
how much they impacted me
Mm.
and made me dream or you know maybe even change the course of my life without my realizing it.
Right.
I would like to think that just as in the classroom I felt I could have an effect, I think that on the written page a writer can too. I think you can really touch people, even if it's only to amuse them, in a dark spot in their life.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a beautiful thing that we have that kind. Do you feel like creatives have a responsibility?
In a way, I do, and I don't mean that in a didactic sense. I mean, I don't think like you have to set out to teach a lesson.
Sure.
I think you're true to your own inspiration, and if that involves putting some beauty in the world, or a little shedding a little light on the human condition, then you can count on that touching someone somewhere. I'm almost sure of that.
I love
And as
that.
somebody who's been an artist too for most of my life, I mean, a visual artist.
Yeah.
I mean, I've also tried. I used to dance, and I've tried
Nice.
playing the violin, not well, but I think with any art, they're coming from such a deep place in the human psyche that if you get it all below the surface in it, you're going to be touching other souls that are swept along in the river with you.
Yeah, I love that. That's beautiful. Um, advice would you give to your younger self if you could go back in time?
Wow. I guess I would say, don't be afraid to live. This
Mm.
because if, say, I knew the younger me was heading in a career of writer, I would say, don't just be writing all the time, or don't just sort of be writing in your head as you live scenes, which I kind of did sometimes. As I was horseback riding through the mountains, I would be describing as she rode along the trail, she saw the beautiful leaves and this sort of thing. Maybe I've given way too much there. But I would say to my that young self, just just cut loose and get into it and experience life. Don't hide behind a camera. Don't retreat into your novelizing side of your brain. All that will come later, but you have to really experience the emotion of the moment and just live it.
I love that. That's beautiful. That's great. I like that a lot. Um, so last question. I love asking this too. You get to the end of your life and you meet God. What would you want God to say about all that you've done? on this earth?
Wow. Um, I hope people say, or she, that I've been true to myself. Maybe that's been a little slow coming. And uh, because if you look at my curriculum vitae, it could appear that I've gone off like a shotgun in many directions. But that ultimately, or not even ultimately, but with each direction, I was somehow fulfilling a purpose, somehow fulfilling who I was in at least in one part of myself.
Mm, I love
Because I
that.
surely we're not all just writer or dancer or scholar or whatever. We have so many layers, so many aspects. I feel like there are lots of careers I could still have,
Yeah, yeah.
if I wanted, if I get bored with this.
I love that. That's beautiful. Where can people find you on social media to follow everything you have going on?
Well, I have a website which is www.N.LHolmes.com. And I'm also on Facebook and Instagram and Pinterest and LinkedIn and all the usual social media.
You're on TikTok? I'm just kidding.
TikTok, no, actually I am.
Me neither.
And I was told that that catered to a demographic that is not the people who read my books. So I
Same for
tuned
me.
in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not on TikTok either. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking to you. I really enjoyed our
For
conversation.
me too. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you all for listening. And always remember to live, love, laugh. We'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.
Bye.